So this book is about the most important areas of research that are going on right now on the politics and political economy of international trade. So it tends to cut deeply into 15 or 20 different topic areas that fall into clusters logically. So my introductory chapter tries to map out a little bit about the evolution of the politics of trade, especially where international agreements are going, where they haven't gone. But the book as a whole really tries to look at the most important research that's gone on in the last decade or so and to highlight those areas of research. So trade is one of those elements of human interaction which seems to be very important historically, culturally, economically, and politically. So part of globalization led by trade is challenging people with foreign ideas, foreign influence, tendencies to try to become more like other societies, consumer goods and products and so forth and so on. But at a deeper level, trade seems to push people to reconsider their identities, to perhaps vary or extend their identities to incorporate some of the foreign, and also to press back and push more towards writing in their own language or products in their own country. So trade is both an integrating force and a divergent force, a force causing divergence on the part of people and companies. A lot of the more recent research shows that trade tends to bring countries together in terms of income very slowly over time. There is a convergence in income levels that's caused by trade. We know that trade adds to growth nationally, and that tends to reduce poverty over time. And we know also that the more advanced Western and other industrialized countries are being tied together more and more tightly by trade that companies do within their own frameworks, within their own corporate framework and network. And this tends to unite economies across corporate boundaries in what we call intra-industry trade. That in turn makes it easier for these industrialized countries to make trade agreements. But it also tends to create some divergence between the products and the markets of developing countries and the more advanced, westernized and post-industrial countries, if you want. So trade is integrating countries. It's advancing regions and regionalism a lot. Most of the trade deals that have been done politically in the last 10 years have been bilateral and regional. And in fact, trade is increasing the integration and the connectedness of regions around the world even more than it is globally. So, for example, in Asia, Asian countries now actually are pretty integrated in trade. In Europe, of course, they're extremely integrated in trade. North America. So with the exception of sub-Saharan Africa, most regions are benefiting from ever more intense trade connections within their region. The problem globally, of course, is that we need strong global arrangements and institutions too, and we need to keep updating those to keep up with bilateral deals and regionalism, because otherwise certain countries and certain regions are left out. So at the moment, the United States actually and the European countries are emphasizing a transatlantic trade deal that the United States would like to complete, and the United States is also actively pursuing a trans-Pacific trade deal that it would also like to complete. And has been highlighted in the newspapers recently that Trans-Pacific Partnership would exclude China. So China's pushing its own version, trying to have a more whole Pacific Basin agreement that it would be included in. So even the United States at the moment is really pushing these two large Asian and European regional deals to the exclusion, really, of a lot of high-level political capital and emphasis on the international trade round through the World Trade Organization. So inequality is an extremely important topic right now, and Thomas Piketty's book this summer, the French economist's book was, I think, a very important addition to this debate. We know that in part pushed by trade, inequality is growing, perhaps not even as much across countries as it is within countries. And so the advance of technology and education and training is probably the most important driver of inequality because it tends to segment economies into lower skilled and highly skilled or highly educated workers. And that process continues. But trade then tends to privilege highly productive companies and products that are made very efficiently, and again, intra-industry trade. So to an extent, while the long-term process of trade helps income convergence across countries, in the short and medium term, trade, while it helps reduce poverty, is also likely adding to inequality. And again, it's adding to inequality because it tends to reward high productivity companies, high productivity sectors, and highly educated, highly skilled workers, and to create more intense competition among low-skilled or lower-wage sectors of the economy, professions, and so forth. So trade is good in the sense of reducing poverty, but it's not helpful in terms of inequality. And that emphasizes the politics and the governance of it again, because countries really have to regulate trade, encourage multinational corporations and foreign direct investment that's helpful to their country, and generally discourage other forms of investment and trade. And of course, part of the reaction is you don't want to cut back on your trading, but what countries do need to do is increase their education processes, their trade adjustment assistance programs, their training for workers. So a lot of the things that economies and societies are seeking to do anyway are very positive and will help countries take advantage of trade rather than have trade accelerate the income gap and the income inequalities. So at the moment, again, a lot of the the politics of trade is holding countries back from making arrangements. And part of that is because globalization has increased the number and the duration of crises. So we had the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, and then we had a major economic sovereign debt crisis in Western Europe. And countries have been scrambling on the one hand to manage severe economic and financial crises. And on the other hand, trade and other aspects of globalization have reached further into countries and are affecting occupational and health and safety regulations and rules. And so now the politics of trade is really as domestic as it is foreign and international. And what that means is that trade is ever more political in the context of especially democratic countries. And it also means that trade is also connected, at least indirectly, with these increasing crises. So the combination of having to manage crises and have to cope with the domestic political pressures means that European Union countries, Brazil, India, the United States have a hard time actually coming together and agreeing on major global agreements. It takes small group leadership, something I wrote a book on in 2008 called World Trade Politics, where you need groups of 3, 4, 5 prominent leaders or trade negotiators from some of the most important countries actually providing international political leadership in that direction. Absent that, which has been our situation for the past 10 years or so, what we're getting is just a proliferation of bilateral and multilateral regional deals that, again, are good if they lead to ever more intensely interconnected regions and opening up of trade markets for developing countries. But regionalism and bilateralism has its limits because it empowers the larger countries that have bargaining leverage, makes it harder for smaller countries that are important to everybody to bargain in groups and to sort of even the playing field. And it also means that we have this sort of spaghetti bowl of agreements that are not all consistent with each other across different regions of the world. So one of the main avenues of possible cooperation, but more competition, is around the ideas that structure and frame trade. And in the West, we adhere to a capitalist, highly competitive notion of pushing for trade liberalization, and developing countries and countries like Russia, China, for example, adhere to a more state-led growth, more state-supported growth strategy. So the competition around ideas is important because the Western liberal consensus, the Washington consensus, is being pushed, pressed, questioned in some important ways by developing countries. And the role of the state and state-supported growth is itself a major challenge, particularly because of the rise of China. Now, ironically, then, one of the main cleavages in international politics is that the most liberal, most open international trade markets are precisely those among the Western and industrialized countries and in manufactured products, where trade barriers tend to be very low, intra-industry trade is very high, and there's a very intense, competitive, but also very productive and productivity-enhancing type of trade. In agriculture, however, the markets are segmented into some that are relatively open and where there are a lot of exports from Brazil, the United States, European Union countries, but a lot of other export markets that are highly protected. So the irony is the West pushing, at sometimes even a bit lecturing other countries about liberalizing and being more capitalist in their framework, while we protect heavily some of the key markets that are most important to the developing countries. So, for example, about 2% of Western countries' GDP comes from agriculture, whereas for many African, a good number of even Latin American and South Asian countries, agriculture is really, shapes the culture, the economy, even the political system, much more importantly. But we've shut a lot of those doors. And part of it is because we have such powerful political interests in the EU and in the US, and also in India and Brazil and China, that protect. So, for example, the sugar sector in the United States is as powerful as the banking sector, and the lobbies that lobby Congress and the executive branch and the agencies are very, very powerful. So places like sugar and cotton is another area, and a lot of the niche markets, everything from Florida citrus to strawberries in California or potatoes in Maine, or especially the dairy industry, for example, is very highly protected. So most consumers in the West don't realize that we're doing substantial damage to developing and many least developed countries by being very non-capitalist, protective of some of these areas. So, the challenge for the future is to, live by the slogans about slow food, local growth, advancing farming and farmers, while understanding that a lot of the money that the FedGov spends goes into a small number of very large agro industries. Very large businesses in the United States don't need subsidies. They don't need high tariff protection. And yet Congress continues to give it to them. So it really is a process of sort of trying to, walk our talk in the West, and yet, understand the challenges in terms of the role of the state in development policy, and the role of alternative ideas in terms of development strategy. So trade cuts across every issue area in international political economy and in national economic policy, from investment to regulation. And so it affects our lives in a very important way, and every year it affects our lives more directly. So the future of trade, in addition to trying to liberalize trade, is to understand how it affects everything from labor rights and human rights to the internet and immigration. So for example, on the movement of people, one of the grand bargains, which in theory should happen, and in practice is extremely difficult, is the most important product for a lot of least developed countries is their people. It's their labor. And people, in some ways, in order to be able to work and earn a living and support their families, need to be able to move around. And sometimes that movement is across borders. So the acceptance of people for temporary or longer-term purposes, for work especially, is a very hugely important part of trade for many countries. And of course, it's a huge issue in the United States right now. It's extremely hot and difficult, complex political issue. And in other countries of Western Europe as well. They're feeling the pressure of immigration. The politics in some ways shifts to the right. And there's some trends, some of them not very nice trends, that come as a result of the pressure from immigration. But the larger picture is that really the movement of people is part of trade. We see it as the movement of goods and ideas, but it isn't just that. It's also about people being able to move around and support their families. On the internet, the United States and Canada and even Western Europe have not really worked together effectively to develop a clear set of policies and a proposed set of regulations to keep the internet free and open. We don't have clear ways of approaching this. We haven't made a clear framework to propose to other countries. And so that the internet itself, that's so central to trade, is an aspect of trade, how we connect with other societies, not just how we sell goods, but how we interact with other societies, the movement, ideas, communication, and so forth. And we're really not doing a very good job yet of trying to project for other people how the internet should be seen, how it should be used, and especially how it should be kept open and free. And then finally, also in terms of labor rights and how people work, of course, part of what happens is we consume goods in the West, but we don't look at the working conditions for the workers that are producing those goods. So that's been a principal connection, is looking back down the supply chain and looking at labor rights. And so one of the things that's happened in the last 20 years, particularly since the passage of the North American Free Trade Area in the mid-90s and the Uruguay round of international talks under President Clinton, is that we've begun to connect environmental protection and labor rights with trade agreements. And so part of the future of trade is really kind of having countries decide how labor rights and the regulation of labor should be integrated into trade. And if countries are pretty clear violators of labor rights, should there be consequences in terms of the trade arrangements? Should we pull back on trade? Should there ultimately even be trade sanctions against countries that are really abusing their workers when we're consuming the products that they're producing? And again, part of it, like the internet, is a decision that countries have to make explicitly about whether we're going to coordinate policies. At the moment, the United States and the European Union, for example, have very different ways of integrating labor standards into their trade agreements. Both think that labor rights are an important part of trade agreements, but we do it in quite dramatically different ways when we carve out those agreements. So it'd be helpful to actually, have an understanding. And again, part of that will be done if we reach this trans-European sort of trade agreement and the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Part of that will be done not so much in the Trans-Pacific one, because those countries sort of reject the idea of regulating environment and labor as part of a trade agreement. But when the U.S. and the European Union do an agreement, then clearly there's going to be some commonality on the way that we see environment and labor rights integrated into trade agreements. And that could be a very good thing.